Good evening, folks. This is Professor Wasser. This is going to be our lecture that introduces the concept of economic philosophy to the course, and Adam Smith. Now, we will briefly at the end of the next lecture. This is going to be broken into two parts, as has been the case so far this semester for a couple of different sections. We're going to cover the basic ideas today and basically end today's lecture with a major concept. And then we're going to talk about that major concept in actual practice in the second lecture. So please be aware of that. We're really not going to be touching on David Ricardo, who's kind of the bridge between Adam Smith and Karl Marx until tomorrow. So I'm going to do another lecture tomorrow and upload that, okay? So for anybody who's curious, that's the way this is going to operate. So let me just make sure my sound is up all the way. There we go. Yeah, now before we even get into Adam Smith, I want to throw a couple of things out there. The first one is why we cover economic philosophy here in this course. You hear economics and you hear economic philosophy, and we almost want to, instinctively want to, relegate that to money. And that's certainly going to be the case in today's lecture and tomorrow's, as well as Marx's in a lot of ways. But I want you to be aware that we can talk about economy and we can talk about economics as it relates to a multitude of concepts. So, for instance, Heidegger would talk about an economics of time, not explicitly, but he's been cited as doing that in his works. We can talk, and that's really kind of an ontological and existential problem, right? Furthermore, we can talk about commodities and commodification and fetishization of commodities in many different areas. So, for instance, I'm a former soldier, well, you're never former soldier. In a previous life, I was an active duty soldier. And one of the things we talked about is how soldiers were treated not as people, but as commodities. When, in all reality, like that may not have been the case in a literal sense, but there was certainly a figurative relationship there. So just know that economics is, it's got wide scope in terms of its applicability. If you think about it, well, we know this, right? We can talk about the economics of the holidays, for instance, and maybe we will in the next lecture. But for the time being, I want you to take a look at these two pictures, and I want you to tell me what you know about them. Now, if this was a class, I'd wait for responses, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you. First of all, these are two characters, right? We got Ebenezer Scrooge and Mr. Bounderby. These are two Dickensian characters. Ironically, Dickens was writing right about the time, or slightly after the time that Marx was writing, Smith was writing, leading up until about the time of Marx. And they're actually, what we're going to say, we're going to kind of describe them as perfect examples of what Adam Smith, a good economic person should be, or economical person should be. Now, we don't typically associate Ebenezer Scrooge or Bounderby with good positive traits, but I want you to be aware of that moving forward. We're going to get to the description of what he's going to call Homo economicus in the last parts of this lecture. And it's very important to understand because in terms of, let's say, societal development, in terms of where Smith thought society was going, these two were the archetypes of what an economic person should be. Now, I want to be clear. He doesn't say every person should be, but an economically minded person, right? We're going to call this the great utility, the economic maximizer, or the utilitarian maximizer. Okay, that does not necessarily mean good, in the same way that always being a workaholic does not always mean good. But there are some things we can take from someone of this kind of character, right? Now, Adam Smith is interesting, right? He's born in Kirkcaldy, Scotland in 1723. So if you pay attention to the time frames that he's writing in, you're going to kind of get a sense of what's going on here. And he's considered the father of modern economics. So it's really interesting. In his major work that we're going to be discussing, it's called On the Wealth of Nations. That's going to give you a clue about where he's concerned with. And the interesting part about that is that On the Wealth of Nations, which is what's going to give us modern economic capitalistic theory, was published in 1776. Shocker, right? We're going to get to that in a moment. Now, a couple of things. He entered the University of Glasgow at 14 to study moral philosophy. There's a couple of similarities between him and someone like Jeremy Bentham, right? Jeremy Bentham entered university very, very early, and they always started off in moral philosophy, but with like many scholars of his time, right? They're going to go in looking at morality as kind of this idealistic theory, and they're going to come out disenchanted. And like I said, in 1745, he's already leaving his educative career due to that, right? And he became a public lecturer and a professor at Glasgow. Now, he was the head of moral philosophy, but his lectures led him to his first major work because, well, if you think about it, morality ties back into something. And at the time, economics wasn't a widely studied theory. It wasn't something that was examined in the same way that we examine other things. It was examined, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't something that was as prevalent as, say, metaphysics or epistemology. Now, he really began questioning that over the course of a 12-year period where he was a tutor around and across Europe. And that's where he'd meet notable figures like Voltaire and Francis Keeney. Now, remember, I didn't read much Voltaire, so I can't say much of it. But what Keeney gave him was this idea of trade barriers, how trade barriers affect growth of countries, and really the idea in its kind of nascent form, there we go, nascent form, word things, I know them, of what we're going to call laissez-faire capitalism later down the road, right? This idea of, few institutional barriers, less regulation, lower taxes, and the effect that'll have on a economic system, okay? So please, 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 we can't underpin how important the influences on Smith are, but how important Smith is going to be in terms of our contemporary academic model. Now, some of you may be, let's say, socialists, or maybe you're sympathetic to socialist ideals. I'm not unsympathetic to them, but it's important to understand that for people like Smith and everybody that follows after him, and at least in a theoretical sense, even someone well, like Marx and all of his the people that follow him, right? The real theorists are always going to say that capitalism is a necessary precondition. You need to understand this. And we're going to talk about it in a couple of moments, but just know that. Now, I like this quote by Adam Smith. Capitalism is when you don't have government, and the more you don't have government, the more capitalister it is. Now, that is obviously not a real quote, but to a greater or lesser extent, that's really what Adam Smith is going to get at, right? In other words, government intervention limits growth of the market, and a limited market means a limited culture, okay? Now, aside from that marvelous wig, okay, The Wealth of Nations, again, published in 1776, this is one of the great epoch-making texts. Folks, you're still feeling the ramifications of it today. In fact, it's not self-evident that we're ever going to, I know there are plenty of people who think we're going to get away from capitalism. Okay, but the fact of the matter is that even if we get away from capitalism in the historical sense, the way we look at markets, the way we look at things like the division of labor, which is a term we need to get very, very comfortable with, those things are going to stick with us from here until, well, let me put it this way, until such a time that we actually create a circumstance where labor is unnecessary for humans. In which case, I hate to say it, folks, labor won't be necessary because we're probably going to be batteries or something else, right? Think the Matrix. I know that sounds very conspiracy theory-esque, but it's not so far-fetched if you think about it. I mean, Elon Musk said it last year that it was only a year or two before we had AI, and we only have access to the most rudimentary ones, you and I, that's going to be smarter and more creative than humans, and that's terrifying. We're not going to talk about that right now, okay? The thing is, Smith was interested in why the 18th century England and the United Kingdom had blown up to such an epic proportion. And that's going to be the fundamental focus of his papers. Now, if you think that the American Revolution was some, small palace affair that didn't really affect things that much, that didn't affect England that much, folks, the economics of that circumstance, and I want to be clear about this. This is kind of a segue, but it's something to understand. If you need to, go look this up. George III, King of England at that time, George III, yeah. George III. He almost abdicated his throne twice over the revolution. So I want you to understand that taxation, government impediment, the way these things affect a culture and a market are massive, okay? And that's one of the things that absolutely underpinned the American Revolution, which was government interference, taxation, interference in the market, right? It wasn't just freedom per se, the American dream. No, we wanted freedom to develop our own markets, our own traditions, if we're going with like Edmund Burke. And yeah, the crowd was really not okay with that for the simple fact that allowing the American colonies to kind of remove itself, extricate itself from the British, let's say, global hegemony, the idea of the United Kingdom in a larger sense. Really, what that was an attack at the, in a lot of ways, the economic structure of Great Britain, okay? Now, prior to that, Great Britain's make the world England, right? Adam Smith wanted to figure out where all the wealth came from. It wasn't just evident to say it just appeared somewhere. Something had to change. And, well, as a scientist, and keep in mind that as part of the post-Enlightenment, the end of the Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment thinkers, science and reason is at the heart of what Adam Smith is doing. Okay, so what he's going to do is he's going to take the scientific method and he's going to apply it to social theory. He's going to look at something and he's going to attempt to make some kind of a hypothesis and then test the hypothesis to see if it works or it checks out in the theoretical sense. Okay, so there was something about industrial society that separated it from pre-industrial society that made it more productive outside of just the presence of machines, or just the fact that, well, outside of just the presence of machines. There had to be something different in the way society operated, okay? Now, we needed to look at the fact that first, machinery and technology is implicit in the development of society in general. If you pay attention to Marx, you'll know that. Smith isn't so concerned with that. He's concerned with more modern technologies, coal, steam, whatnot, the idea of the, let's say, factory, okay? And these are going to be things that are going to allow, these new novel technologies are going to allow England in similar cultures to develop at a faster pace than places that were in previous epochs, more serfdom, feudalistic situations. Think like Bohemia down in towards the southeast of Europe, or even up towards certain parts of the eastern regions of Germany. Okay, so I want you to think about that. Now, if we go into the next slide, right, we see that, well, after 20 years of writing, so he started in 1756, right? He's going to present a logically oriented economic treatise on the nature of Britain. And it's going to be very similar to something like Hobbes. Now, folks, I want to be clear, if you read Smith and you read Hobbes, and you do have an excerpt from Smith this week, a couple of things to read from him. Sorry, I apologize to you. Reading the British empiricists, and yes, that includes Hume, who was famed for his humor. And I don't mean that, that's not a dad joke. I mean that literally. He was supposed to have been a funny guy. I don't think the humor translates into his writing. In any case, these are dry, sometimes difficult to read texts, if only because, there's no flair to it. I don't care what anybody says. The British empiricists, they don't have any wit to them, which is sad because, you've got like your Jonathan Swifts, who on the creative side of things, right? We read William Barrett in this class, and Barrett was talking about how Swift and the adventures of Gulliver's Travels, right? And you've got this great satirist in the British ranks, and then you've got Hume and Smith and Hobbes, and Hobbes and Hume and Hobbes and Smith, and it's David Ricardo. It's just, they're all saying important things. Good Lord, are they difficult reads, if only because they're dry. I wanted to warn you, if you felt the urge to read On the Wealth of Nations, go for it. You should. Everybody should. Just know what you're in for. Now, he's going to break that book into 3 separate sections, right? The one is going to be all about the division of labor, okay? The second book is going to be all about the process of capital accumulation. So right here, we're already going to have a different definition for capital, okay? Capital is not necessarily the same as, let's say, money, right? Getting some of that internet money, as the South Park Canadians would say. I should specify the South Park Canadians. They're not, much to Trey Parker and they're not all flappy-headed two-dimensional individuals, right? The third, and this is going to be interesting, is a comprehensive economical history of the West. So basically, he's going to attempt, in a lot of ways, what Karl Marx does in Capital, volumes 1 and 3. He's going to attempt to understand the history of economic development. I think Marx does a better job of it, ironically, because of, and I don't say this about Friedrich Engels much, but Friedrich Engels was as much a scholar of history as much as Marx was a great thinker in terms of his ability to project and look out into the future what might happen, right? This kind of, maybe perhaps not practical history, that's historical materialism, which we'll cover, but this, okay, here's where this thing should go. He was wrong, but it was a damn good guess, and we'll talk about why next week, okay? What you need to understand, I'm going to read this word for word, is that the history of human society relates to the enlightened scientific approach to society in the same way that data relates to a physicist's studies. There are some fundamental similarities between what a physicist draws out of his studies about the universe and what an enlightened scientist pulls out of society. You're going to get data, and the way we look at that data is going to be very, very key to the way we understand it, right? So the thing here is he's going to notice a very stark similarity between, and this is in the second book primarily, the differences between the previous form of economics and the current model of economics. He's going to talk about basically how mercantilism was where if you had a certain trade good, silk, right? The trade guilds were the ones that determined the prices of that. So if all the if people selling silk were all part of the trade guild, the guild set the prices, and no matter where you went, these people would not undercut each other. Well, the problem is that it creates a situation where the market itself is not going to grow. And that is the major key here for Smith, which is the idea of the market. The market is what dictates the culture, okay? And in this case, you've got something stultified, stagnated. You know, they're minimizing imports. So basically, a country is known for one thing, but they're going to maximize export of one thing, and that's what they do. Well, under a capitalistic system, you've got a multivariate market where imports are coming in and exports are going out, and that's what we have, right? We're always sending things out and bringing things in and sending things out and bringing things in. So that's the really, really important thing that comes out of the second book is this idea of the market and how the market is affected by different types of import and export. We should also talk about how that second book is also finished up with an analysis of public spending. So basically, he's going to look at, well, and this is contemporary budgeting, right? Looking at how your sovereign spends the money, where it goes, and how your culture is doing. So, folks, when we have a 3,000-page omnibus budget going through Congress, right, Adam Smith is sitting there rolling in his grave because the fact that we let that go through unchecked is just not even inconceivable for Adam Smith. It's improper and something that should not happen. Like, you should have a real clear determination about how your government is spending money, right? Now, we're going to talk about the first book because the first book is where the really important part of this lecture comes. I think this is the last slide for today, and we'll move into other things. No, we're going to have 2 more slides, okay? Folks, the key thing that separated the old mercantilistic society from what we're going to call capitalistic society is, for all intents and purposes, the division of labor. Now, if you look back at that guild structure, you know, we can see that now today, kind of when we look at things like Etsy, although that wasn't a guild structure. What you had craftsmen, okay? And the difference between craftsmen, and I think I kind of moved ahead of myself. No, we're going to stick with that, is that a craftsman, for all intents and purposes, one second, let me make sure I don't go too far ahead of myself. Well, you know, they are a master of their crafts, but they do everything associated with a particular craft, whereas the division of labor is going to be the characteristic that defines contemporary economic models. We're going to talk about that when we talk about the pin factor. What we need to understand right now is that, okay, what is the division of labor? Well, the division of labor, definitionally speaking, is just the breaking down of processes into their smallest constituent parts so that basically untrained laborers can complete multiple steps, and then the things are kind of congealed together into one sellable product, one sellable commodity, right? So we see this with things like fast food restaurants. Folks, you do not have a chef at a fast food restaurant. What you have is Joe Snuffy on the grill, and you have Joe Snuffy at the assembly line, and Joe Snuffy on the Joe Snuffy C on the French fry machine, and Joe Snuffy D at the counter. Like, they're all doing one small component of the ordering process, and then the customer gets the product. But they're all paid minimally, but it's more efficient. Okay, we're going to get to that again tomorrow. That's the thing that Smith identified as the, let's say, primary factor in the development of the United Kingdom. Okay. Now the question is, well, then what impedes division of labor? Why would anybody impede this division of labor? Well, here's the thing. People would impede the division of labor for any particular reason, right? There's always this incentive to kind of micromanage anything. Some of you might already know that, right? Like, I'm not gonna lie, like, my wife is a little bit more artistic and a little bit more flamboyant than I am in terms of behavior, right? And every now and then I get the urge to, because I have to be more organized in a lot of ways, micromanager behavior. Hey, hon, I need to do this, and if you don't do it, we're going to be in trouble. And that's bullshit, but sometimes you say it like that to kind of get your point across. She's going to probably never let me live that down for saying it on camera. My point here is, folks, there are multiple things that might kind of inhibit the division of labor. But what Smith is going to say is that, well, your division of labor is directly related to the market for any particular commodity. So if you have a large market for, let's say, fast food hamburgers, right? You are going to naturally develop a division of labor to make those things at the fastest possible level. This is going to entail mass production, right? So you only end up with mass production if you've got a market to cater to that mass production, okay? But basically that means extending the market, and the impulse to control these things, and even things that don't control these things naturally, artificially, like as the market increases, it's like any big organism. As something expands, becomes bigger, more problems develop. Folks, I hate to tell you, I'm a bodybuilder, right? As bodybuilders get bigger, more problems occur in our bodies. Why? Because there's more that the body has to take care of. That's why, like, dudes on juice, right? Their hearts blow up. Why? Well, because you weigh 300 pounds going into a show. You're 350 in the off season. Your heart has to account for taking care of that entire body, right? Well, something is likely to go wrong. The more moving parts in a thing, the more likely it is to go wrong. And that's just fact of the matter. That's just the reality of economics in capitalistic society, or any society, really. The question is how does that affect the division of labor specifically? Well, if you've got more moving parts, there's more likelihood that something will go wrong as the thing expands. Now, what kind of things can go wrong? Well, we can have two impediments. We can have natural causes, space and time. Folks, if you are a hamburger vendor, or if you're a grape jelly vendor, right, and you've got a storage facility, you can only store so much in the storage facility. It's grape jelly. It's going to go bad if it's not refrigerated. Okay, so there's another thing too. Is it refrigerated? Is it big enough? But then another thing is too, you got to ship it. And you can only ship so much at a certain time, at a certain speed, to certain locations. Nowadays it's a lot quicker, but in any case, folks, we still suffer from these natural impediments, which is space and time, okay? The other one are conventional causes. So let's think about, how things like state and government interference affect markets. Well, for instance, who here smokes? I don't smoke cigarettes anymore. I smoke cigars from time to time in a pipe, tobacco pipe. Legitimate pipes. I'm not trying to get weird about that. Yeah, folks, like cigarettes, Marlboro menthol 100s, when I used to smoke, cost $4 something a pack. Now, they cost like $9 in New York. Now it's $10, $11 here in Pennsylvania. This is going to date this video, obviously. But the fact of the matter is that state and government interference has corralled that market in and placed certain kind of interference on it. And the growth of that market is suffered because of it. It's also suffered because of, societal understandings of how tobacco affects you. But in any case, right, what we have here is that you have this societal interference. Now, you can get around that, right? There are, let's say, technological ways you can go about it. So anybody who knows anything about, tobacco knows you can buy loose tobacco, and it's the same quality as stuff like Marlboro, and you can pack your own cigarettes, and it's not very difficult. Most people are just too lazy to do it, So the reason I bring that up is because there's always a technological work around these, let's say, impediments. But the fact of the matter is that you can't get through the regulatory impediments outside of perhaps, hydroponics, growing your own tobacco, Now, these interferences ultimately affect the happiness of society, and that's going to be the thing that Smith is ultimately concerned with. Folks, money can't buy happiness, but it can certainly promote happiness. Adam Smith is going to say that, a capitalistic society is ultimately aimed at the felicity of its people, right? And by kind of reining things in, right, you're ultimately reining in that whole idea of felicity. So, stopping monopolies, that one's tough because at the same time, when there's a monopoly around, right, you generally have a product that's cheap and widely spread to the masses. But, at the same time, if it's a monopoly, they can basically jack the prices up. Same thing with protective tariffs. If we put a tariff on something, anybody who's bought anything from Europe in the past 2 years, knows, okay, you bought the thing, now you got slapped with their $30 tag on top of it when it came into the United States. The rationale behind that is, and by the way, there is rationale behind that for Trump, and I'm not arguing one way or another, is that, well, before you grow the external market, you have to take care of the home market. And Trump's not wrong there. Okay? I want you to understand that. So just remember that Smith is concerned with how wealth and human felicity relate to one another. The wealthier our society is, the happier it is. I think we all know that. If you pay attention to the 90s, I think we're the happiest we've ever been in a lot of ways. But he's also right in a lot of sense that, well, so long as you have separate, distinct cultures, if there's no home market, there is no home. So that's me kind of spitballing there. Now, what I do want to talk about is the concept of the invisible hand, and I'll cut it off here for today. This is the underlying concept of laissez-faire capitalism. Okay, laissez-faire. I don't know how to say that French very well, but you know what I'm saying. Laissez-faire. Basically, it's this: if the government leaves the market alone, then it's going to naturally equilibrate itself. That doesn't mean industries won't rise and fall, and there might not be economic downturns, but that if you just leave it alone, for instance, if the widget market crashes, well, something's going to come in and take the widget market's place, and there'll be a new thing that'll help the market come up, and that'll crash, and something new. So basically, there's this idea of revolution, even in Smith's, commodity factory theory, that says, okay, if you don't over police it, it's going to level itself out. That doesn't mean there won't be peaks and valleys, but that free, unrestricted, rationally self-interested people will ultimately maximize their productivity output. They'll find things to produce to make themselves happy, and therefore will basically continue to produce things in a way that will make us happy. Okay, so tomorrow I'll be doing the lecture on, well, basically getting into the division of labor a little bit more. We're going to have a short video, and then we're going to talk about the pin factory, okay? So please be aware of that. We're also going to talk about the labor theory of value, and we're going to talk about how the labor theory of value, as provided by David Ricardo, is going to bridge us into Karl Marx. So with that being said, folks, have a great rest of your night. See you tomorrow. Bye.